Expected. Um, Good morning, everyone. I'm a little shorter than Elise. I'm Dr. Zoe Staines. I think I've met many of you. I'm a senior research fellow here at the UQ School of Social Science, and also obviously a member of the LOC, which is why I've been buzzing around like a crazy person. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on here today. These are the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, always have, always will be, unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. And I pay my respects to elders and leaders past and present. It strikes me that over quite a few of the sessions yesterday, and actually in a lot of the research around basic income and a lot of my own research, that a common theme is just how much we have to learn from Indigenous knowledges and perspectives and experiences. So it gives me great pleasure and I feel a great privilege in sharing this session today. So I'm not going to waffle on. I will introduce our wonderful speakers. So today we have the wonderful Bella Moke joining us in person. Thank you so much, Bella. We also will have some people joining us on Zoom. So we have Rangikaheke Kiripatea. We have Janell Dymus, Tjanara Goreng, and we also have a pre-recorded presentation. Hi, Tjanara. A pre-recorded presentation from MP Leah Gazan. We will kick off with that pre-recorded presentation, and then we will hear from each of our speakers who will give about a 10-minute address, and then we'll have time for Q&A after that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our pre-recorded presentation from MP Leah Gazan, who is a member of the Lakota First Nations community in Canada. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Leah Gazan, and I'm the very proud Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre, which is located in the province of Manitoba in Canada. And I'm really pleased to join you today from the unceded, unsurrendered lands of the Algonquin peoples, an Indigenous nation in Canada, a place that others know as Ottawa, to address the Basic Income Earth Network International Conference about the movement, and not just the Canadian movement, but surely, as I speak to you today, the global movement in support of a guaranteed livable basic income. Because since being elected in 2019, I have sought to use my platform in Parliament to support this movement and further the conversation about the need to implement a guaranteed livable basic income. Certainly something that has been on my radar as a longtime anti-poverty advocate in the city where I'm from, Winnipeg, as the former president of the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg, because poverty is not inevitable. In fact, one of the things that I have called poverty is one of the most violent human rights violations, because it's a choice. It's a choice to keep people poor. It's a political choice that in one of the richest countries, and I'm talking about Canada, on the earth, people are still forced to use food banks or sleep on the streets because they can't afford groceries or rent. And it's a political choice that deeply impacts my constituency I represent, where 40% of kids are living below the poverty line. That's why last year I chose to introduce my private member's bill, Bill C-223, an act to develop a national framework for a guaranteed livable basic income. Because the bill that I am proposing for a guaranteed livable basic income is in fact not for specific groups in Canada, but for anybody living in Canada who needs it over the age of 18, including people with disabilities, families, single people, students, temporary foreign workers, permanent residents, and refugee claimants. So when I talk about a JLBI, I know that there's different ideas of what that will look like, but my specific bill for a guaranteed livable basic income would be, in fact, what I'm proposing, a predictable cash payment provided unconditionally by government to everyone who needs it without work requirements. Critically, it would build on the current and future government supports that are being offered in Canada, not to undermine them. And I think that's really critical, because my bill is not proposing to gut the social safety net in Canada. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's to build on our current social safety net for those who are falling through the cracks. And that's why I'm very clear in my bill, and I'd like to encourage everyone considering a guaranteed livable basic income that it must be administered in addition to increased investments in things like social housing, healthcare, and other public services. It is, again, meant to strengthen our social safety net rather than replace it, because we know a guaranteed livable basic income, in fact, is not a silver bullet. We cannot put in guaranteed livable basic incomes that gut other services and supports, which could potentially leave individuals in greater depths of poverty. And this concept, in fact, is not new in Canada. And for some groups in Canada, we already have forms of a guaranteed livable basic income. Low-income seniors in Canada, for example, receive a guaranteed income supplement after they turn 65, but I will argue it is not livable. In fact, 15% of single seniors live in poverty, and predominantly this group is senior women. And I share that because much of the work that is unpaid that was performed by women, many women don't have any pensions that they can live on, and so it's gendered. We know that poverty is gendered, and it's more pronounced, not just gendered for women, senior women, but also to Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Canada. We also have something that's called a Canada Child Benefit that has been put in place to help elevate families so that kids don't have to live in poverty. Again, not livable, and shamefully, 1/3 of all food bank users in Canada are children, and that is despite the fact that children only make up less than 20% of the population. And here's the thing, the bill I'm proposing for a framework for a guaranteed livable income, livable basic income, would not only improve on these current income transfers that we have in place that are insufficient, it would also lift people with disabilities out of poverty. I say that because when you're looking at the number of individuals that are living in poverty, in fact, 70% of adults living with intellectual disabilities in Canada live in poverty. This is abhorrent. We need to change that. We need to change that so that people aren't legislated into poverty. And again, although there are disability payment rates that vary between province, none of them are livable or near the amount that would allow recipients to live with dignity. In my province that I live, the province of Manitoba, current rates for individuals are a mere 1,068 Canadian dollars per month. That is far below the poverty line. It is far below the poverty line. Again, poverty is targeted in Canada. Poverty impacts certain groups more than others. We need to change that. We need to change that to support equity and a more equitable world for all. And finally, the movement for a guaranteed livable basic income is connected to reconciliation and justice for Indigenous peoples. Canada, like Australia and many other countries, was built on the violent dispossession of lands and resources of Indigenous peoples. The impact of colonialism is still deeply felt by way of poverty. And I very often share that first they took away our lands, and then they left us homeless on our own lands, and then they made it illegal for us even to be homeless. This is abhorrent. And we know that poverty has had huge impact on Indigenous populations. For example, incarceration rates are much higher. Gender-based violence experienced by Indigenous communities is far greater than the rest of the Canadian population. I'll give you some examples. 40% of Indigenous children live in poverty, including 60% of those who live on reserves. A stunning 80% of Indigenous women who are in prison are there for poverty-related reasons. Poverty is a form of economic violence that is killing our people. And we know that there is a direct correlation between poverty and violence that has resulted in the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and Two-Spirit in Canada, something that our current Prime Minister Trudeau likened to a genocide. There has been thousands of women that have gone missing or murdered, and this genocide is ongoing. So it's not surprising when we had a national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls that was released 3 years prior, that one of the calls for justice, Call for Justice 4.5 of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, calls for a guaranteed livable basic income for all Canadians, including Indigenous peoples. And this particular inquiry, it was historic, because what it did was it recognized this ongoing crisis of violence and the roots of that violence: violent colonialism, poverty, social exclusion, and racism. We need to change that, and one of the ways we can address this in Canada is by putting in place finally a guaranteed livable basic income, and heed the call for Justice 4.5 that came out of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. Now, I'm sure it's the same for you, but I know in Canada, some critics have called and said, we can't afford a guaranteed livable basic income. But the reality is we can't afford not to. We need to start talking about the high costs of poverty. Poverty is expensive. We know that in Canada, conservative estimates place the cost of poverty on our healthcare system at $7.6 billion annually. And we know that it's good economics to look after people. I mean, we should be investing in people instead of big corporations. We need to divest from corporations. We need to divest from big oil, and we need to take those monies, and we need to start investing in people with a guaranteed livable basic income. I mean, especially in Canada, where they seem to have found money to provide subsidies for credit card companies like MasterCard or big grocery chains, but yet we are still fighting to ensure that all people in Canada can live with dignity and security. So I thank you so much for inviting me to your conference. I wish I could be there in person, but I look forward to connecting with some of you in the upcoming months, particularly this year as we ramp up the campaign for my bill, Bill C-223, in support for developing a national framework to develop a framework for a guaranteed livable basic income. I look forward to meeting some of you, even though it could be virtual, and I wish you all the best as you have rich discussions about how to fight for a better world for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, MP Gazan, for making that pre-recorded note to us. You know, I think as MP Gazan alluded to, you know, our histories of violence, settler colonialism in Australia and Canada are quite similar in a lot of ways. There's a lot of knowledge sharing that can take place between our two nations. Thank you very much. I would like to now introduce our next speaker, the wonderful Bella Moke, who's joining us in person. Thanks so much, Bella.
Te aroa te waka, te aroa te iwi, moerangi te maunga, roto kākehi te moana, te whakarewa o pe taua, a wāhea te kāinga, wāhea te tūpuna, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning. My name is Bella Moke. I've used my mother tongue as an Indigenous Māori of Aotearoa, New Zealand, to acknowledge my connection to the land of my forebears, my tribe, my mountain, my waters and my village. I respectfully acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of this land, and to you all, Zoe and others who are hosting this Congress. Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings. I come with my fellow colleagues of Te Ututeka, Hei Oranga i Aotearoa, Basic Income New Zealand. I'm speaking to the opportunities that basic income presents for Indigenous people and communities. We've got a word in Māori, which is whakamā. This word wreaks havoc with our sense of well-being, be that spiritually, emotionally, or physically. Translated, it is to feel shamed. It is to feel a sense of inadequacy and unresolved. A natural response is to become disconnected. Another response is to lash out. Whakamā is a huge discussion on its own, but in terms of today's session, when money is coming in every week, no questions asked, I'm going to talk through whakamā through various scenarios at a grassroots level. And at this point, I must acknowledge Jessie from Canada and all the photos and all the narratives that are around here for this session. We met in India, in Hyderabad, and her story is really compelling. And I think there's a connection between our Indigenous people and those who tell their stories in these right, who tell their stories. So I'm going to take the same kind of journey as well. So I'm going to describe some situations. So for instance, a baby girl, basic income, money coming in every week, no questions asked. The chance to be better cared for by mum is more likely. Mum can feed and clothe her properly. The probability that she stays with mum rather than be stripped away by government agencies is higher. Mum is in a better place. And this is where whakamā or shame is no longer an issue. In another family, mum's 11-year-old son, who on one late night stands up to his father when he can no longer witness his mother being routinely and severely beaten by an alcohol-fueled dad. This boy is beaten to a pulp. To his utter shock and surprise, however, mum chooses dad. She tells her boy that he needs to go. He doesn't know how to, or she doesn't know how to explain to him why. You know, that's a true story, actually. She cannot leave the house. She has other kids to raise. She stays at home so that no one will see her black eyes and bruises over her body. The boy is devastated. This is a whole other story. Back to mum, she now has her own money. She doesn't need to stick around. Gosh, this makes me really emotional, sorry. Oh, heck. Whakamā, shame is no longer an issue for her. And yet another family story. For their preschool daughter, mum and dad know that their child can do really well by going to an early childhood facility down the road. And they can do this because the child has had a nice brekkie. Mum and dad can put nappies in the little baby's carry bag. They have petrol to take their baby to the school. A regular income from BI every week, no questions asked, has helped here. Whakamā, Shame is no longer an issue. Kids in the early years of school with basic income, paid weekly and without any questions asked, they now have Weet-Bix and toast for breakfast instead of going to school with an empty belly. They have a school uniform, probably nicely washed, and they probably have some pretty nice shoes as well. In this scenario, a better attendance record is likely. Whakama'a, shame, is no longer an issue. Kids 7 years of age through to leaving age, a better school attendance record is more likely because they no longer have to stay home and look after the younger brothers and sisters. They can keep up with their schoolwork. They don't come to the notice of teachers. They enjoy school. They're able to participate more in sports and other activities. Again, whakama'a, shame is no longer an issue. For those who have left school, they've learned good habits and they are better equipped for work or higher education. I'm going to say it again, whakama'a, shame is no longer an issue. Shame is no longer an inhibitor. Another concept that is Māori and can be a whole other subject in itself, we speak of mana. Mana is about having power and control of self. It is also about having a sense of honour. Māori men historically are the hunter-gatherers, the providers and protectors of their families. Strip them of their mana and the consequences are poor. It will look like these scenarios. They lose their job, they're struggling to find work, they struggle having had a tough upbringing, they've struggled in school, they've got kids to feed, they've got a partner always in their ear. How can they be providers and protectors? Basic income, bringing money into the household every week with no questions asked. Mana can be preserved. Providing for their families is possible now. Violence in the home is less. Mental anguish is reduced. Relationships improve. We know all of these. Whakama'a and mana are just two concepts that inform a Māori worldview. I hope I've demonstrated some of how basic income could affect change for the good of Māori. And here's an added bonus. Our Māori leaders have said for a long time, what is good for Māori is good for everyone in New Zealand. At 17% of the total population in New Zealand, Māori currently figure in the worst statistics for the country. I believe basic income is the answer to turn the tide. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Bella, thank you so much. That was so powerful. And I don't think that you were the only person feeling emotional in the room. So thank you so much for your honesty and raw emotion. Really appreciate that. So next we will turn to Zoom for our upcoming presenters. We have next on our list, fantastic, hi, Rangikaheke Kiripatea, who is Zooming in. Hello, Rangikaheke. How are you? If I can welcome you to unmute yourself and present, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Ko te arawa tāngata, ko te arawa waka mai make tū ki tongariro. ko ngā tiwhenua ko pako e tu atu nei. He iwi ko paki I te rotorua nui a kahu, I kauria nei e hine mua ki moko ia ki atu tānekai. Ko whakapau ngā kau te maunga, he ruru whenua ki tōku marae o rua mata, no reira he mihi nāku ki a koutou I tēnei rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good morning, everybody. I want to begin by introducing conference to what Māori refer to as whakatauki, spelled W-H-A-K-A-T-A-U-K-I, whakatauki, or pronounced whakatauki, are proverbs or metaphors that support critical thinking by allowing others to consider another way of thinking from a worldview other than their own. The whakatauki I refer to is ka mua, ka muri. A whakatauki that means walking backwards into the future. The idea being we look to the past to inform the future. In 1840, the British Crown agreed to sign a treaty with Māori, the Treaty of Waitangi. In my view, it was not only a poignant moment, it is also when our journey of change, disruption, and uncertainty began. That is, you fix one problem, but you create a whole lot of others for yourself. So let's just leave that sit for a moment. Between 1830 and 1840, Māori had 60 million acres of land. Notice I didn't say owned 60 million acres of land. We had 60 million acres of land. Today, we have about 5 million. How the heck did that happen? Leave that too and move forward to 1994 and consider Crown Māori relations when a treaty settlement envelope unilaterally fixed a fiscal cap at $1 billion on all historic land claims. Called the fiscal envelope, the government tasked one of our Māori leaders with travelling throughout the country to sell the envelope contents to us. At every turn, our leader was told in no uncertain terms to bugger off. Needless to say, the envelope never made it into the fiscal mailbox. And speaking of envelopes, look, Bella and I, my colleague, kia ora Bella, will really push the envelope during our presentation tomorrow. In the 13th century, Māori left our Polynesian homeland, Hawaii, in the South Pacific for Aotearoa, having already sailed the vast oceans of Kiwa, Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, long before they had a compass or any other seagoing instruments to guide them, using only the stars and weather patterns to guide them, with which they had an intimate relationship. One of our ancestors, the late Sir Peter Buck, described them as Vikings of the sunrise. And the Vikings, he recorded as Johnny Come Lately. Another challenge regarding the introduction of a basic income. Another challenge regarding the introduction of a basic income is the impact that colonisation continues to have on Māori. Back in the day, I must not speak Māori was written as a punishment on many scoreboards across Aotearoa. Wait for it, it was written 100 times. I know because I was one of them. The paternalistic attitude and the impacts of colonisation are prevalent across Aotearoa, and in my view, it will take another generation or two for change to be realised. Ongoing historical and paternalistic attitudes and policies that lead to an extraordinary notion of people wanting to save Māori. From what, for goodness sake? In the 13th century, our people left their homeland of Hawaii for Aotearoa, as I said, already having sailed across Moana, the Te Moana Nui Akiwa. All this speaks to Māori having a deep distrust of government who speaks to a narrative of a fundamental change. This in my summary of challenges for presenting a basic income to Māori. Presenting a basic income message and who the presenters are. Then there is the language and content. The language used to convey the basic income message can only get lost in the content of the detail. And that brings discontent, it brings inertia, it brings boredom, it brings disinterest, etc. Applying the KISS principle of keeping it simple, stupid, is perhaps the biggest challenge. My personal challenge is developing a basic income message in a way that is clear, precise, and dare I say, exciting. This includes developing an elevator pitch that is delivered with clarity, with punch, and with excitement. But perhaps the biggest challenge is credibility. In my view, presenters must be Māori. They should be young. Their standing in the Māori world acceptable. They must be fluent in Te Reo Māori, in the Māori language, likeable, and above everything else, have a good grasp of the basic income detail and deliver it in such a way that is engaging and easily understood. Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora. Thank you.
I think that's it. Yep, good. Rangikaheke, thank you so much for that poignant address. We really appreciate that and appreciate you making the time to be here this morning. Thank you. If you can hang around on Zoom, that'd be great. And we'll have some Q&A after. But if it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Janell Dymus, who's also joining us on Zoom. Janell, thanks so much.
Thank you, Zoe. Tatahi e mihena kia koutou te mana whenua, koutou nō te iwi moi moia. As my 4-year-old says, the keepers of dreams are those who live in the lands of Australia. And kia koutou te mana whenua, ki te wahi o Piripane e mihena kia koutou. So thank you for having me today. I'm going to just very briefly recite my pepeha. My mountain, my maunga is Mātiti. My awa is Waiowika, my river is Waiowika, and my people are the people of Te Whakatohia. You'll notice from Te Rangikaheke, Bella and myself, we always position ourselves with our mountains, our rivers, and our people, because this is how we connect to each other, and this is also how we identify the mountaintop upon which we stand, and how we identify how we connected to other people. So when I hear other people's mountains, other people's rivers, and other people's nations, I mihi to them and I connect to them. The reason I start with our mountains, our mountaintops, is that every person stands on a different mountain and every mountain has a different view of the world. So if I'm standing on the mountain of Mātiti and you're standing on the mountains in Brisbane, we both have different views of the world, different experiences of the world. And this is a fundamental principle within Te Ao Māori, which recognises that the lived experiences, the livelihoods and the realities of each individual, their family, their wider community are all different and therefore require nuanced responses to meet their wellbeing goals and their realities. When we talk about So that's where I want to start. I just want to speak quickly, and Bella mentioned some beautiful principles in terms of whama and mana. I want to speak to what is effectively a traditional taxation or economic system within Te Ao Māori, which is that of a koha system. So koha, K-O-H-A, and this system is essentially an organic economic system of accountability and mutual obligation between the giver and receiver. So within a koha system, the giver and receiver are unequivocally bound to each other, each acutely aware of their position in the redistribution of economy, and each acutely aware of their interpersonal connection with each other. And this koha system, it still exists within Te Ao Māori today. We still use it most prominently within our marae when we're welcoming visitors, and you might be the visitor this time, you might be the person keeping the home fires burning the next time. But the system of koha effectively creates relationality between each other. What New Zealand has seen in terms of colonisation is that this system has been disintegrated and a third party inserted in the form of a welfare system, which has effectively dehumanised the process of koha and not done a great job at replacing the system with something that recognises the well-being of each individual, each family member, each community, and of society as a whole. So that's kind of where koha has landed us. We have very, I think they're terrifying pieces of legislation in New Zealand over the course of 180 years, which have disenfranchised Indigenous peoples from their lands and culture. So we have the Tohunga Suppression Act in 1907, which eradicated the use of Indigenous healing methods. We have the Native Schools Act, which asked us to stop speaking our language. Okay, it didn't ask, it forced the use of Te Reo Māori, of the Indigenous language, into silence, and Te Rangikaheke spoke to that poignantly. And then we have the Native Lands Act, which dispossessed Indigenous peoples from their lands, and none of this has been remedied over more than 200 years to an extent that it facilitates the well-being of whānau. My background is actually in public health, and I think that's important to kind of speak to, because what we in public health, and specifically in Indigenous public health, our work is in the advancement of Indigenous sovereignty, and the challenges that we face within Māori public health are all resultant of dispossession of Māori from lands and culture, of the failure or the removal of a koha system with nothing to replace it. And what we're seeing now is an undiagnosed public health crisis across a bunch of health areas, social areas. So when we look at education outcomes, poor social outcomes, poor health outcomes, issues like gambling harm, all of these are symptoms of poverty in today's society, but more impacting is that these are the impacts of intergenerational trauma forced upon families and communities who were dispossessed from their lands and cultures, from their way of life, which have not been remedied within the current system. And I want to pull up a quote from Moana Jackson. He was a legal academic and just an amazing mentor for us in New Zealand. And he says, identify the causes from the symptoms, deny the assumptions, and stop the terror. And when we look at the public health crisis that are upon our families, our communities in New Zealand today, that is the terror. That is the terror that we need to be stopping. And at Hāpai Te Hauora, where I work in Māori public health, universal basic income is one of the most critical responses that we could make to address so many issues for whānau. A universal basic income recognises the mountaintop. Some of us are on mountaintops, others are in valleys, others are in trenches, others are drowning trying to tread water. But a universal basic income recognises everyone wherever they are in the world and recognises their standing and their tread upon the world. A UBI, Universal Basic Income, brings us closer to a koha system. It attempts to create relationality between people. It disintegrates a system where you are only your worth based on your contribution to the economy or your contribution to society in the world, in the view of Western philosophies or views. And most importantly, it returns agency to whānau and communities and facilitates well-being against the standards set by each individual and their whānau, their hapu, which is their sub-tribe, and their nations, their iwi. So being able to understand that, or being able to have access to basic income, effectively facilitates what we in New Zealand, or we as Indigenous peoples in New Zealand, refer to as tino rangatiratanga, or the right to determine your own well-being for yourself. So that's kind of my kōrero for today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Janelle. Really appreciate that. I hope our Zoomers can actually hear the rounds of applause in the room for them. Oh no, but be assured you are getting big rounds of applause. So thank you so much, Janelle. It also gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who we had the privilege of hearing from yesterday as well. Tjanara, Goreng. Please start us off whenever you're ready. Thanks so much.
Juju Maberanu. Goreng in the Namin, Juju Maberanu, Gaya Mamarangu, and Jagungungayungung, Jagungungayungung, Jagungungayungung. Naibiangi Waka Waka, Ninanguranga, Darudamu, Naijayong Ningan, Urayange, Naija, Yurang Daring Yigu, Naigarang Waba Waba. I listen to all my elders and teachers. Today, tomorrow, and together, we all created dreaming. Together we are strong and we are one mob. This is a welcome from my Waka Waka and Woolly Woolly clans of the Jawan Jumbi Nation. Thank you very much. I am with you today on the lands of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people in Australia, and I thank all of you who are on the lands of our nations, wherever you are, First Nations people all around the world, and welcome you. Thank you very much. Today we were asked to talk about basic income in terms of Indigenous people and communities from our own perspective, and what opportunities and challenges would be in it. So first, I'd like to begin by saying in First Nations communities in Australia, income support has gone from being an important and vital welfare support system when it was introduced to a punitive system of shaming and blaming, a notable feature of British behaviour, especially in colonised countries. First, though, a bit of history to give context to challenges and opportunities for a UBI in First Nations Australia. The history of income support for First Nations community in Australia has become in the past 17 years an increasingly punitive and shaming system that was first, developed by the Howard government in an era of First Nations social policy where practical reconciliation was the foundation of all national policy. What this meant was that change had to be evidenced and measurable and not about platitudes and rhetoric, but it became ultimately a policy where funding became more limited and less was expended to provide for programs that were practical and achievable in First Nations communities. And there was no real desire in the Conservative government of the time to really do vital work in our communities, which can be seen now. Our representative body at the time, ATSIC, was disbanded for disagreeing with the government, and this ensured a blanket national policy that increased neglect and increased poverty amongst our First Nations communities. The Northern Territory intervention of 2007, which was architectured by John Howard and his Minister for Aboriginal Affairs at the time, required the removal of the Racial Discrimination Act in Australia to change the Social Security Act just for First Nations people. Under the Stronger Futures legislation, which it became via successive ALP and NLP governments, for the next 15 years, it had transgressed the human rights of First Nations people and any semblance of welfare support justice rights for mostly the 47 prescribed remote area Black communities it was constituted in. And that also ran over into other communities around Australia. This policy was government-sanctioned punitive welfare reform policy, where they tested their new welfare reform measures with the help of various First Nations factions and leaders, and they funded 17 years of increased poverty, abuse, violence, loss of employment, education support, and medical services and housing reform to those communities. The income support regime was then piloted in white communities in Australia to broaden support for making this reform permanent as welfare policy. The challenge for us is to never return to such a system and to never allow Commonwealth government to override human rights legislation as they did, and to allow them to use the social security system to discriminate against First Nations people, nor their powers under the Constitution to make special laws for First Nations people, which enable them to do this. In 2007, the Close the Gap campaign was created as a non-government response to the Social Justice Commissioner's report, where he asks the government to close the gap in health disadvantage for First Nations people. At the time, there was a 17-year age gap in mortality between white people and Aboriginal people in Australia. The Closing the Gap policy was implemented in 2008 by the new Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, with a statement of intent. And I share this with you because I want to show you the contradiction between two policies that have operated for the last 17 years in First Nations affairs. Our challenge for the future is to embrace a new partnership between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, he said. The core of this partnership for the future is closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians on life expectancy, educational achievement and employment opportunities. This new partnership on closing the gap will set concrete targets for the future within a decade to halve the widening gap in literacy, numeracy and employment outcomes and opportunities for Indigenous people. Within a decade, he said, to halve the appalling gap in infant mortality rates between Indigenous and non-Indigenous children, and within a generation to close the equally appalling 17-year life gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people when it comes to overall life expectancy. What we know about the Closing the Gap, every report every year ever since, has only ever succeeded in increasing the tertiary graduation rate of Indigenous people who go to university, and none of those other measures have ever changed much. So this policy came into being a little bit after the Northern Territory intervention that was set up by Howard that produced the cashless debit welfare cards and the basic cards, and other strict control measures in prescribed communities, such as sending your children to school and the no school, no pool policy. It continued to oppress and create poverty. It was shaming in its use. People had a high level of inability to access services because often they lived hours and hundreds of kilometres away from any local supermarket where they could use their basic card. And because of the remoteness, there was then an increased gap between access to health and medical facilities and a decrease in medical centres and housing reform in those communities, despite the government continuing to say that they were injecting millions of dollars into First Nations communities. So these two policies of closing the gap and the Stronger Futures legislation are contradictory in nature. They are a complete contradiction, and they have been consecutively operating in Australian politics for the last 17 years. The politicians and groups involved, including the Peak First Nations Coalition, of major Indigenous organisations around the country do not see and do not challenge this contradiction. The two policies have continued to operate consecutively for 15 to 16 years alongside each other, whilst one purported to support First Nations communities and the other stripped away any of their rights. This history of welfare reform in First Nations community was a targeted and punitive welfare reform agenda amongst the growing conservatism in Australian governments, where First Nations communities are often practice targets for changes to income and welfare support to reduce the national budget and hopefully create a surplus economy. A UBI that is free and universal with no conditionality is an important mechanism for First Nations social justice and human rights welfare reform. 20 plus years ago, when these systems were introduced, 20 plus years ago, a system was introduced to First Nations community, essentially called a work for the dole system, and it was called the Community Development Employment Program. Over time, there was evidence of great entrepreneurial ability utilising CDEP, which was essentially a Centrelink work for the dole income in First Nations communities. So they often did things in the community that were economic, social and a cultural investment for those communities and a way for people to gain access to gainful employment and to develop businesses. So a number of Aboriginal businesses and entrepreneurs developed out of the CDE program, but it was removed when Howard brought in this other system. As a basic income for work system, it became in some areas very entrepreneurial, with communities using their skill base and workforce to undertake all types of clever adapted employment and work programs, which led to successful business developments. And the same could occur within a UBI system. Current welfare system we know is punitive and paternalistic, and it gives no incentives to anyone to involve themselves in development, either as individuals or as groups. The system is socially destructive and it impoverishes people, families and communities even more than they already are. Why would we as a country continue such a disastrous social policy? And it's just beyond understanding. So let me talk about some challenges for us of implementing a UBI for First Nations communities. We must ensure that it's not punitive or conditional, that it is free, available to all and unconditional. Therefore, the architecture needs to ensure this, and the bureaucracy must have strict controls on it to ensure that it does not create punitive behaviour through lack of cultural understanding, systemic racism, or the old behaviour of government bureaucracies relating to those in need of welfare support, such as shaming, blaming, treating people as less than because they do not have employment or are not gaining gainful employment. To use it as a system of economic participation and encouraging of Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurship and social enterprise. To educate and inform communities prior to its introduction on how it operates and how it is used, and that this information be translated into all First Nations languages, but particularly where English is not a community's first language. This often doesn't occur in the Australian government when they change policy, particularly social support policy. It's not often written in Aboriginal languages or translated, but it's translated in every other multicultural language. To ensure it is funded, to ensure that it gets to all First Nations people, especially those in remote communities, through proper funded community engagement and participation through education support programs. Some of the opportunities for a UBI, I believe there are great opportunities for it for our people. It can provide an income that will be socially supportive and economically viable to Indigenous people where paid work, entrepreneurship, business and strategic investment are currently non-existent. It would enable individuals and families to support themselves and each other and provide for the necessities of living, which welfare dependency does not. It would take away the shame and lack of dignity that comes with having to live on a basics card. What kind of society are we creating where we shame people for not being able to gain employment in areas where there is virtually no available employment, or for not having the educational qualifications to work in the only jobs available? It can provide a socially responsible system of income, which allows Indigenous Australians, particularly those in areas with little or no prospects of paid employment, a way to have an accessible income with incentive to do other things. Many Indigenous people in remote communities have access to utilising their cultural traditions and knowledge for business development. With the right support, they have the capacity to employ community members and engage a wider section of the hospitality, tourism and business sectors in their communities. Their environmental knowledge and the development of scientific research around plants and medicines and a myriad of other uses for industry. There is also a great area of developing mining, Indigenous people involved in mining, whether that's something they want to be involved in or not. Providing a basic income, which is not government controlled or shaming in its application, will enable a population that has been riven by discrimination, racism and prejudice for such a long time, a platform on which they can stand and build social, civil and environmental foundations to better their lives, not only for individuals and families, but for entire communities and regions, particularly in remote areas. Another point that requires consideration is that many Indigenous people are suffering generational trauma. This impacts their emotional and mental capacity to engage in work, the education system, or other meaningful activities. This is a social crisis that needs to be addressed, not in a punitive way, but in a compassionate, empathic and socially just and socially conscious way. Providing a UBI could do this in addition to supportive social programs which enable recovery, to enable a person to work towards working and community engagement and development. It gives breathing space to enable an individual to do what is necessary, to get well, to deal with the myriad of social issues that impact their families, so that they can return to health and wellness and become useful members of society. It is obvious from the statistics reported annually in the Closing the Gap reports and the Productivity Commission data on First Nations people that the current systems and social policies in Indigenous affairs are not working and are making no difference to this generation of Indigenous peoples. We need a new road and a new vision. A UBI can begin this process. And I want to give you a small example of one of my Anangu relatives in the Central Desert. When I was visiting some months back, she lives on a basic card. They all live on basic cards, and they look after about 15 small children as well as a number of adults. And so usually in this community, people in families tend to share the incomes on their basic cards as much as possible for things like shopping and other essentials. And so my auntie was going shopping, and she came up to the 5-star resort where the supermarket was, and we were sitting at the cafe, and she wanted to go to the supermarket. So she had to ring the Centrelink office to get them to transfer money from the bank account onto her basics card so that she could go shopping. So this was my first view of such an interaction occurring, and it was revolting and horrible. And she was, you know, obviously has to do it very often, so it doesn't bother her. So she rings up and she's talking to somebody on the Centrelink line, and this person says, so there's this much money in your account, how much money do you want? And she says, okay, can you transfer this amount of money into my account? And they go through this sort of back and forth for a few minutes, and eventually the person transfers the money into her account and tell her she can now go shopping. This is a 55-year-old woman who, you know, is now like the matriarch of this family because her mother has just passed away at 80 years old. And she has to talk to this non-Indigenous person that she does not know on a government Centrelink phone line to ask her to take money out of an account and put it on a basics card so she can go shopping for the kids and make sure that people have food that night. And I'm sitting there, my colleague who was with me, completely appalled listening to this, imagining what it would be like if I had to ring up the Centrelink office every second day to find out how much money I have on my card and how much I could use. And it was then I had this incredible feeling that this is so disgusting for us as people who are sovereign in our own country to be in a position where an individual related to me, I'm watching her having to deal with this. This is a woman who has cultural seniority and thousands of years of knowledge behind her and in her life, who is looking after land in the Central Desert and sacred ceremonies and important sites, and is well known and connected and used in that way by national parks and wildlife and various other government organisations. But in order for her to have an income and to have money to go shopping, she has to ring a selling person to get the money. And I was so disgusted. I mean, you know, it happens, but then to sit there and listen to this interaction and have to listen to the way they carried on about it was just revolting. So I really support a UBI and entirely am focused on it, and to that end have joined in with, so I can tell you that the Australian Greens First Nations network, of which I'm the National Secretary, will be pushing for a UBI for First Nations communities to be as I've already described, so that we do not do this to people, that we do not do this kind of shaming and oppression to an individual who deserves a right to have their own income and to decide what to do with it and to take it out of the bank when they want it. So for me, a UBI is such an important process and such an important thing to get into legislation and policy in Australia. Thank you very much. Ua palia.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Tjanara. It's fantastic to hear from you. Again, you just received a great round of applause in the room. You know, I think your stories just make me think again and again of the fact that, and actually all of our panelists' stories, you know, make me think again of the fact that colonialism is a structure, not an event, as Patrick Wolf puts it. You know, the story that you just told about that palpable everyday experience of violent paternalism is, you know, really points to that. So thank you so much, Tjanara. Okay, we have about just under 15 minutes now for some Q&A. So can I open up to our audience? Would anyone like to ask a question of our wonderful panelists here today? We've got some roaming mics. I think Kristen down the front, maybe Elise, would like to ask a question.
Thank you all for your generosity in those contributions that you've made, and for doing the work always of educating all of us who are here on your stolen lands. I guess one thing that kind of came up a few times yesterday through the conversations that we were having is this question of whether a basic income is enough to make up for colonialism and for colonisation and the ongoing harms. And I just wanted, I know it's not the topic of this session, but whether any of you had reflections that you wanted to share about the things that aren't fixed by a basic income and the kinds of other system structures and reparations that might need to be kept or to put in place to make sure that there is meaningful kind of justice for First Peoples.
Thank you, Kristen. Bella, did you want to respond to that first, and then we can turn to our Zoomers? Is that okay?
That's a good question.
Look, obviously I'm a strong advocate of basic income. It's a start. It's a start to healing. Basically that. Anything is better than nothing. Anything is better than what we've got now, which is zero, in my view.
Hang up here, Bella, if you don't mind. Rangikaheke, did you have any thoughts on that question? So our question was, you know, is something more than a basic income needed to make up for the violence of colonisation and ongoing colonialism?
Look, Zoe, thanks for giving me the opportunity to respond to that. I think it's the amount of basic income that's going to be telling on a lot of it, on a lot of Indigenous people. I think it's, you know, we seem to be, and I'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow, we seem to be fiddling with government policy at the moment. Whatever is put in place currently is just not enough. Excuse me, I've just got to answer something here.
That's okay, no problem. So do our other panelists have a response while Rangikaheke's offline? Yeah, Tjanara, let's go to you.
Yes, it reminds me that when Kevin Rudd did the apology for the stolen generations, he says there will be no reparations. And of course, you know, they're not going to pay us out billions of dollars and pay the rent for all the stolen land since 1788. They're just not going to do that. The budget's not going to even be able to do that. No one's even going to think about it. So the importance of a UBI, we've got to begin somewhere, and income support is where we should begin. It has to be a proper amount. It has to be an amount that allows a person to live with dignity, with the necessities of life. The current income support system of $46 a day doesn't cut it. It's got to be much, much better than that. And it's got to be at least, you know, somewhere up near the minimum wage, for heaven's sake, because people can't even afford rent now. Everything's just getting so out of hand. So I think it's time to pay the rent, and why not start there? We should write it in our treaty. Thank you.
Yes, I think you've got agreement in the room. Thank you, Tjanara. Janell, did you have any response to that question as well?
Yeah, I've got probably two key points. I think the importance, I don't think anything can undo the harm. You scrunch up a piece of paper, you can't flatten it out again. And I think that's a really important starting place. But the thing with a universal basic income is what it does, and it's really important that it's about returning agency to whānau. So when Tjanara talked about having to ring up Centrelink to get that money, it's about saying, actually, it's not up to institutions, it's not up to the government to decide who is valued and how they're valued in the world. And so a universal basic income just recognizes the humanity of people and their right to live well, live freely, and live happily, whatever that looks like for them. And I think this is a really good starting point. And one of the other pieces of work that us as Hāpai Te Hauora, and I guess wider Māori society are working towards is constitutional transformation. That was the work led by Pa Moana Jackson in New Zealand, and currently by Margaret Matu, which says, what does the social fabric of New Zealand look like? Let's clean slate. We can't forget the trauma and forget all of the harm that was caused, but let's have a national conversation about what our society values and draft a constitution that is based on that, rather than our imported laws, imported belief systems, which doesn't account for the realities or the position of Te Ao Māori or the Māori worldview. And I think that's a really important piece of work that needs to go alongside this basic income conversation, because it's society's values and then how society values individuals, whānau, hapu, iwi, and communities.
Thanks, Janell. Do we have any other questions in the room for our wonderful panelists? Do we have any questions online, Bridget? No? Yes, Elise.
Thank you so much, all of you. And I just think this panel's been so critical, I think, for the movement, because I think when people start writing about basic income, you know, people cite European scholars, American scholars, settler scholars as the sort of source of the argument of why a basic income is important. But I think all of you have shown us many worldviews and many different ways in which we can understand the importance of basic income. And I think, you know, I think that's a challenge for all of us writing, to be very thoughtful about, you know, who we centre as, you know, the arguments for basic income and framing basic income. But my question is something about this question of universality. And I think it's interesting, the movement of Black Lives in the US on their reparations platform had a universal plus basic income. And so that was a universal basic income paid to everybody, but people of colour, First Nations people got paid more to never to be able to pay back for what has been done and what has been taken, but to at least to acknowledge the cost that is placed at people of colour's feet and First Nations feet from colonisation and slavery. And so I'm just wondering about this question of universality. Should it be paid to everyone? Should it be paid at the same amount? Or should there be an extra bit to acknowledge the sort of racial violence that has been levelled at people over the years and continues to be? And I guess the second part of that is, and sort of linked to Tjanara's comment, you know, who gets to distribute the basic income? Who gets to, so if it's universal, then does that mean it has to be administered by the state? Because as we've seen from Tjanara's conversation, the state is such a colonial enterprise. It continues to reap violence even in the name of equality. So who should be administering that basic income? Bella, did you have a response to that?
I go after the
Absolutely. Would one of our online panelists like to go? Tjanara, do you have something to say about that? Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, you know, it never occurred to me about the universality and the universal plus. And to hear that from you, I find that really interesting, and lots of thoughts go through my mind about it. You know, like if we put it up as First Nations people, everybody's going to scream and carry on about, you know, we're getting special treatment like we always have. So I think, yeah, let all the white people put that up as a and let all the white people say it should be in there, because then, you know, maybe the women will come along and say, well, we should get extra because we're women, and on it will go. And so, yeah, that's something that has to be decided in the architecture of it, isn't it? Something that's designed in an equitable way, where people can make consensus agreement about it and really collaborate and unify around what the architecture will be. And the other part of the question is such another big one that has to be decided, isn't it? Because there's always that danger, you know, we start off with this great policy and then suddenly it becomes this horrible thing over time because of the way it does. And so checks and balances need to be put in place then. So, you know, you can't leave it to trust that one government bureaucrat is going to behave proper under the law often. So I'm not sure, maybe there needs to be a special commission of people that run it. We just see what they're doing with the NDIS. Oh my God, such a good idea, and they're screwing that one up too. So yeah, this is something that has to be decided amongst everyone, is my view. Thank you so much for bringing it up though. It's a great idea. And I'm all for the plus, but I don't want to put it out there because everybody's going to say you blackfellas just want extra.
So I think all of the basic income scholars in the room are taking that on board to put that up. All of the settler scholars, I should say. Thank you, Tjanara. Janell, would you like to add anything?
I think the starting point is always going to be that universality, because we want the same thing for all. Like if everyone has that basic income, then basic needs are met. And I think, like when I think about in my line of work, we're talking about families that need food on the table, children being able to go to school, those kind of things, access to prescriptions for some children, all of these things which are critically important. And I think we've got years and years and decades of intergenerational trauma which we have to I guess contend with and are continuing to fight the crown every day on, but I don't want it to get lost that some families cannot make ends meet. And like 5 years ago, I remember I wasn't able to make ends meet. Like I was living debt collector to debt collector to loan shark to kind of make ends meet. And I think for me in that position at that time, I don't think I would have cared whether I was Māori and dispossessed of my land 100 years ago. So I think those are really important, incredibly important conversations to have, not to discount that we actually deserve to live with tino rangatiratanga and live in mana motuhake, and to not have to have the reality that colonial violence was perpetrated upon us for many generations. So I think it's one and the same. And I think what is that universal, is it a Māori, a universal Indigenous income, universal dispossessed from your land's income that goes on top of basic income? But in my view, this basic is what is rent, power, bread on table, warm homes kind of conversation.
Thank you, Janelle. I'm not sure if we still have Rangikaheke online. You still joining us, Rangikaheke, and maybe just not on the screen?
Yes, I'm still here.
Did you hear our last comment about basic income plus, and would you like to respond to that?
I didn't hear the last question, no.
The question was really just, whether we should have a basic income plus, so additional income for First Nations and Indigenous peoples. I'll invite you to respond, and then we have Bella, and then we might wrap up the session. Would you like to respond to that?
Very briefly, look, I don't think that it's an additional income on top of the basic income. I think that the basic income should be across the board. I mean, as much as I've had a lot of issues with government and still do, and a lot of issues with a lot of other views here in Aotearoa, I still think that a basic income needs to be provided right across the board, and not just to Indigenous people, as well as a side income. I think we all have to make our way in this world, and I think that along with basic income comes a lot of fairness. And I think this is where we need to get to, is in that approach of fairness to everybody.
Thank you. Bella, last one goes to you.
Okay, from the point of view of keeping it simple, really that's your answer, keep it simple. Although there should be a provision for just the exceptional cases. And so long as the door is open for that, but essentially it would be across the board.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Bella. So that wraps up our session. We are right on 10:30. So thank you so much to our panelists again. Thank you very much, Bella, Moke in the room. We've got Rangikaheke, Kiripatea online. Thank you so much. Janell Dymus and Tjanara, Goreng. Thank you so much all for joining us. We've, I think, taken a lot away from today's session. So we really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you. One more round of applause. And can I invite anyone in the room to join us for morning tea out on the lower podium today, just outside the building? Thank you, everyone.